Slavery is perhaps the most twisted condition that one human can put on another. The restriction of their will, the redaction of their freedom, and the fashioning of their power to benefit their master without any compensation is very much correlated with a superior-inferior complex that only strengthens over time, over generation after generation of the slave condition. Africa was a continent that hinged its entire civilization on the work of slaves. Empires of gold in West Africa were heavily built on slaves, and Mansa Musa's great journey to the Mecca was accompanied by and attended to by his slaves. Europeans followed the same suit. In the Middle Ages, the serf system essentially kept the poor at the bottom and erased any chance of traversal up the hierarchies of the counties and the lands. Kings and dukes and nobles had nothing to do with menial work, while the lower classes tended to the basics of the country, so that they didn't have to. In the discovery and exploitation of the New World in the 15th and 16th centuries, this mindset prevailed and flourished, alongside the idea of racial inferiority. The Native Americans were perfect fodder for the Europeans to practice their eagerly instituted beliefs about the inherent superiority of Europe. As such, the rest is history. The natives were incorrectly branded as Indians by Christopher Columbus, to where it's still a term used today, and were then subjected to the greedy enterprises of the New World settlers. Plantations were formed, women were raped, men endured back-breaking and often fatal work, and perhaps the worst of it all, children were born into slavery. As the use of slavery evolved in America, settlers found a more efficient way of slave acquisition. Tired of natives dying constantly and of indentured servants leaving their stead after some 5 years, they traded with the Africans on the coasts. Both parties were happy to oblige. The Africans got money for selling enemy slaves, and the Europeans had a more efficient source of labor for the tobaccos and sugars. Years passed, and the Atlantic slave trade reached its peak. Within the decade from 1780 to 90, there was an average of 80,000 slaves that traveled to the United States each year. The sheer quantities of African slaves making their way into the United States fit alongside almost perfectly with the formation of the new nation, and slid in smoothly with the views of most everybody in the US, in particular the agrarian Democratic Republicans from the South. In the 1790 federal census, there was found to be over 690,000 slaves in the United States, which made up roughly 18% of the population. In comparison, free white males over the age of 16 made up about 21%. Also worthy of note, in the northern states, excluding Maryland, slaves made up approximately 2.5% of the population, with 49,257 slaves in total. Maryland and the Carolinas had over 100,000 each. Virginia had nearly 300,000 at 292,627. This did not get much better. Even though the Constitution prohibited any slave trade overseas by the year 1808, slavery was already deeply rooted in the South. The invention of the cotton gin by Eli Whitney made sure that the masters of the plantation would be able to effectively rely on slave labor. King Cotton became the presiding feature of the South, and the association of African Americans with slavery was not close behind, if not ahead. Slaves reacted to this in a fashion that would be reasonable of any person born into servitude. There was an overwhelming and horrible amount of adaptation to the condition. Slaves would not be able to be married legally, but they held their own communions. While families would be disassembled and rearranged on a slaver's whim, slaves often created surrogate families. Not family by blood, but family nonetheless. There were a few that attempted to rebel, notably in the era of good feelings, but none were successful. A few years after the election of John Quincy Adams, the rebellion led by Nat Turner took the lives of some 100 people, 60 of them white. Instead of promoting equality or freedoms or any real abolition-minded changes, it reinforced the racial inferiority that had been festering in the minds of the slaveholders of the South as the years went by. Always an issue that was of disapproval in the North, the practice of slavery became challenged more blatantly by outside parties. The most historically visible of these was William Lloyd Garrison, an ardent abolitionist that believed that the Constitution was for slavery, was involved in the American Colonization Society that wanted to send all the slaves back to Africa, realized that wasn't the best idea, formed The Liberator, the first ever abolitionist newspaper, helped to found the American Anti-Slavery Society, and pushed for the expansion of rights for slaves after the Civil War. The first salient abolitionist slave was a collaborator of Garrison for a period of time. Frederick Douglass, however, was a man who blazed his own path to the rights of the enslaved. He himself being a slave until adulthood, his keen views on abolitionism won him much influence in the United States. In the years leading up to the sectional disputes of the 1850s, he wrote an autobiography that entailed of the experiences that he had as a slave, and his works in the literary and social and political fields following made him the leading black figure of abolitionism in both antebellum and Reconstruction era America.